it's a great honour to have a place in this illustrious series, and really good to be here. I'd like to say thank you also to those who've come back for more, because there are one or two faces I see who were there last autumn when I gave my lecture in the E.G.R. Taylor series. And on that occasion, I laid out my case for dismissing the received wisdom that in this period, the Royal Navy showed neither an interest in nor an aptitude for hydrographic surveying. I sought to show that with the encouragement of enlightened senior officers, men like Nelson, who had an acute appreciation of the importance, strategic and operational importance of hydrographic intelligence, rather more than 350.
I would turn the wheel for use this arrows, yeah.
Sorry, let's move it. No.
And get rid of that. Just clicking. Yeah. Just click. Yeah.
Sorry, it's not stepping over.
It's because we've still got there. It should work now.
There we go. I'll pick up my thread again. With their encouragement, rather more than 350 personnel from the Royal Navy made over 1,000 surveys. And I said something about their methodology, the instrumentation that was available right through the range from rapid sketch reconnaissance surveys to more formal work. And I said something about their background and particularly their education. Well, all those themes will come out tonight. But what I want to do through the medium of 5 case studies is to show how these practitioners and their skills where they were frontline operators and their skills were identified, refined and demonstrated in frontline operations. And those themes come out in the first theatre I'm going to take you to in the first case study, the East Indies, where all successive first flag officers throughout this period, Cornwallis, Rainier, Trubridge, Pellew, Hood, all had that acute appreciation of the importance of hydrographic intelligence and set their people to work to gather it. And yes, in that theatre, the East India Company was and had been active with some very fine hydrographers, such as Archibald Blair. But there were still wide swathes of unfamiliar seas, particularly where rivals, such as the Dutch, kept information close to their chests. Well, for this first case study, I want to take us back into that significant wedge amongst the practitioners, the masters. The navigational specialists on board ship in this period, certainly in the early part of the period, personally responsible for ensuring that in the ship there was a requisite outfit of charts and navigational books. They were also specifically instructed under Article 7 of the Admiralty Instructions to gather hydrographic intelligence, a task which they were regularly reminded of, as in that circular on the right-hand side of the screen, and usually with a scarcely veiled threat. If you expect to be paid, make sure you get your remark book and make sure that it's laid out in the way we expect, making clear the operational significance of the information. Is there somewhere where the fleet is going to want to go? How do they get in there? What are the navigational marks to help them? What are the resources there, particularly wooding and watering? Are there fortifications? What's the attitude of the people there? Well, here's our first character, Mr. Duncan Weir. Now, sadly, we can't find anything about where he hails from in the documentation. I come from north of the border. I reckon that's a Scots name. And he's one of the significant number of Scots amongst the practitioners, both officers and masters. And to me, that's a marker of the very significant impact of the Scottish education system, which by contrast to the situation here south of the border, made mathematical education widely available and advanced mathematics at that. And there's quite an interesting sample there. I'll just let you skim through it while I read slowly through the last sentence, which I've underlined. Navigation appears in the curriculum at this period of most of the schools in the villages on the coast. Quite remarkable, I think you will agree. Well, here's the service record of Duncan Weir. He joins the Navy in London as a first-class volunteer during the War of American Independence. At that point where it's hotting up, France and Spain have joined the combat. Comes in at quite an advanced age, 21. He's advanced very quickly to able seaman and then midshipman master's mate, indicating to me probably not just that Scottish background, but also experience in the merchant marine, which you will, I'm sure, be aware of, is common with many of the Royal Navy's masters. He's paid off at the peace, but in 1790, with the Spanish armament, he comes straight back into the Navy, passed for master, serves in a series of 6 frigates in the Channel and West Indies, and then is advanced to master of the 44-gun ship Resistance, which deploys to the East Indies. And it's there that he's going to make his mark as a practitioner and in frontline operations as Admiral Rainier deploys with a force into the Spice Islands to capture the Dutch possessions there. And this is Duncan Weir's affair sheet of Banda Islands. And this work was calculated to catch the eagle eye of Peter Rainier, who doesn't waste any time. He moves Weir into his flagship, the 74-gun ship Suffolk, as the master. This next image I'm showing not just to emphasize the draftsmanship skill, which caught Rainier's eye, just pose a little question for you. Just look down here in the right-hand corner by the cartouche. Was it general amongst British seafarers at that time that they remembered that infamous massacre of Amboina 100 years before? Or is it a mark of Duncan Weir's superior education? I don't know. However, we're interested in his surveying, and we have a lot of survivals to look at. And this is what we call a collector sheet, a sheet on which to lay down the outline of the coast, the offline dangers in pecked dots, the soundings he's taken, recommended anchorages. But what I want to focus you in on, though, is this shoal patch here and this legend, fishing stakes. Navigational danger, yes, but also a navigational aid. Those stakes buoy that patch. But now let's look at his final fare chart. Lots more information on that, particularly of topography. The soundings are there, the recommended anchorages, but look back up at the Narrows, and now that legend isn't there. My guess would be that we see here the results of a council of war, admiral, flag captain, and the master. We don't want to encourage people to go through that channel. Well, Rainier prizes Weir highly, and he deploys him throughout his theatre to improve operations. One of the great perils for British warships deploying from the roads off Calcutta, Madras, or any of the ports on the eastern seaboard of the Indian mainland and the newly captured base of Trincomalee are dangerous shoals on the northeast coast of Ceylon. This is one of them, Pedro Shoal, and Rainier sends Weir off to survey this and gives him plenty of resources. He gives him the Amboina sloop and the Mongoose gunbury, which Weir is able to leapfrog along the inner edge of the shoal. He's then able to observe angles into them from the baselines he measures on the coast, all as part of his control scheme. And you can see here subsequently, with that position of the Mongoose fixed, you can star lines of soundings from it. Let's take a look at the general pattern of soundings. And notice how inshore in the surf zone, the lines are run parallel to the coast. This is all boat work, and I can say it very glibly, but just consider the seamanship involved. I wonder whether he used local seafarers and their boats. Out over the shoal, where again we see the leapfrogging vessels, the lines run right angles to make sure the contours are laid down accurately. A fine bit of work. Here's his survey of the other shoal, the Mole Shoal, and again, look at the control here, what ties the survey down on the ground, angles observed out to the ships, their boats, and to buoys laid on salient points. And again, along the shore, to give scale to his survey, he measures a series of baselines. And from each of those points that he surveys in at the end of the baselines, he would take additional angles out to fix the position of the ships. And we'll see also how he uses it to fix his position in his sounding boat. Again, an amazing number of survivals of his work to show us how he did it. This is where he plots every one of the positions where he took a sounding. Now here he's almost certainly taking horizontal sextant angles. But at this time, the sort of device that I had when I did precisely the same work in the last century, the station pointer was not available, it had just been invented in Britain, but not widely available. So every one of those fixes he would have painstakingly plotted on tracing paper and then pricked through onto this plot. He then takes another sheet, places it on top, and inks in his soundings. This is work of the highest order, and we're highly prized by Rainier, not just because of that sort of work, but because of what he does on board the flagship, where Rainier looks to him to tutor and mentor promising young men amongst his protégés, including here Peter Heywood. You'll recognise the name, I'm sure, formerly of the Bounty, turned into a really highly competent hydrographic practitioner. And here he is learning the craft with Duncan Weir, both producing a fair chart of the island of Dew. Back in London, there was someone else who highly prized Duncan Weir, and that was Alexander Dalrymple, hydrographer at the East India Company, now also moonlighting as the hydrographer to the Admiralty Board. He receives a massive amount of information coming in from Duncan Weir, not just work that Weir himself did, but from other ships on station. But it was the high quality of Weir's own work that Dalrymple particularly appreciated. And I just want to pause here and just mention the importance in this period of the small scale chart for campaign and passage planning. All the lovely plans we're going to look at were all fine and dandy, but where were they? How did you get? They needed the small scale chart for that. And to construct that, the hydrographers needed precise positions for ports and landfalls all the way through a sea and a theatre. And here we see that sort of work produced by Weir, fine astronomical work to fix the latitude and longitude by chronometer and also by lunar distances. In Duncan Weir, Rainier has something that many an admiral longed to have in that period, a surveying master on its staff. Well, let's move to our second case study. I'm going to slip two people in here, but I think you'll see the parallels between them. And here, what I just want to communicate is the challenge of maintaining these skills in the Navy. A lot of people drifted away and were lost to the Navy. This is our first man, William Macpherson Rice. I stress that middle name, but I can't pin anything to it. It came from Teddington, Middlesex. Joined the Navy in the War of American Independence as a 15-year-old midshipman, deployed to the West Indies, and was very quickly given an active warrant as a master. And he was one of the masters and pilots out there in the riverine operations on the American coast, Penobscot, Charleston, where they operated in the front line under fire, pathfinding to the fleet. Like Weir, he's paid off at the peace, but then he achieved something really quite noticeable, which must tell us something about his education, perhaps about his aptitude. He secures the patronage of a captain and a warrant as a schoolmaster. And if anyone knows more about schoolmasters, I welcome your opinion, but I don't think it was easy to get that sort of warrant. He deploys in the 44-gun ship expedition to the Jamaican station, and there he makes a huge pile of really rather splendid surveys of the ports. Look at the intensive sounding here. Comment on the nature of the bottom and these good leading marks. There's a whole book of these. We're indebted to the late Professor Michael Lewis for preserving this wonderful survival. Well, with the coming of the French Revolutionary War, Wright is one of the first promotions to lieutenant, and he goes out in the expedition ascent to the Cape of Good Hope, where his skills are very quickly noted. Here he is at Cape Strand, providing hydrographic information to match the work of the army surveyors ashore. Everything we're looking at there was subsequently submerged under the huge docks at Cape Town. But his main task, which is given by Admiral Pringle, is further afield. He's sent along the coast to eastwards, the coast which lies on the flank of every British warship and convoy going to and from the East Indies. A coast where it's good to have some harbours of refuge, a coast where they're also looking for supplies of ship timber to repair ships on that voyage, and they're looking at the great stinkwood forests in South Africa. Here's his survey of Mossel Bay, a fine survey, very swiftly made into an Amberley chart by Alexander Dalrymple. Good views, very fine topography, depiction of the coastline, the fringing dangers, plenty of soundings and recommended anchorages. Again, this is boat work and in the surf zone, calling for great skill. Here's part of a survey of Clettenburg Bay. Note the anchorage here, just off the government timber store, where they were gathering in the local timber. While he was out here, he met John Barrow, the future second secretary to the Admiralty. Barrow wrote that Rice is a highly skilled man. And certainly that's what the local flag officer thought. And he was absolutely devastated when Rice fell seriously ill. He was surveyed, and the Admiral was told, you've got to get this man back to Britain if he's to survive. It's too late. He died. He was a widower. He left two small sons, one of whom is rather more famous than him, a master shipwright and a leading naval architect. His father vanishes into obscurity. I doubt if any of you have heard of him before. Here's the man I'm matching up with, Patrick Brady, an Irishman. This is the memorial that he submitted to the Admiralty later on. These memorials are sometimes a place where we can pick up wonderful information about these people. He's a late entrant to the Navy, 22 years old. No evident seagoing experience beforehand. He goes in as a landsman. He's serving in the flagships in the Mediterranean and is very quickly advanced to able seaman and then midshipman. But again, like Rice, he achieves something I think quite remarkable. He manages to secure the patronage of a captain and a warrant as schoolmaster. And in fact, he gets two in a row. In other words, the first captain was willing to commend him to another captain. And in that capacity, he serves right through into the peace years up to 1819. But he starts off when the worldwide conflict is intensifying with the entry of the United States into the war. British cruisers now being dispatched in all directions after sometimes spurious, sometimes very real American corsairs. And he has joined the Phoebe, Captain Hillier, which is the first ship to pursue certainly a very real threat, David Porter's Essex, which descended on and decimated our southern whale fishery. Now, Hillier and a number of his officers made hydrographic observations, but the main practitioner is Patrick Brady. Here his chart of the road of Juan Fernandez as the search went out amongst the oceanic islands. So a little note there with some improvements by P. Brady, suggesting that he may have worked from an original Spanish chart, but he's made his own additions, in particular, a good observation for latitude and longitude by luminous. Here's his hallmark views, are really effective and really characteristic of his work. This is his plan of Valparaiso, where, of course, Porter was cornered. Again, he's probably working with another plan in front of him, perhaps a French chart in this case, but again, he's added his own information, particularly a good observation of the position. But this is definitely his work. A trigonometrical survey by P. Brady of the Bay of Callao. This was copied throughout the force out there, really valuable because it enabled ships to penetrate the quite difficult approach channel to the anchorage off the port. Again, very atmospheric and effective view. Well, I mentioned that he was able to transfer to another ship as schoolmaster. And in 1819, that ship was at Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. For some reason, he tells us in that memorial that he decided he had better prospects elsewhere. And so he took ship to Britain. But the merchant ship in which he was traveling was wrecked in Table Bay. He went along to see the naval authorities to claim some back pay. They spotted his skills and, like Rice before him, set him to work along the coast, this time to the northwards. And we can see the path of his survey shaded in green. Again, a good depiction of the offshore dangers, soundings to indicate the extent of the shore, of the shallow water out to the shelf edge. What particularly catches my eye here is the way that he picks out the bergs, which for ships out in the approaches will be invaluable to find their position on an otherwise fairly featureless coast. And along the coast, he takes time to produce some very fine surveys of anchorages and harbours. And during this work, he's acting master of the frigates on station. And it's at this point he thinks, I've had enough of all this. I'm going back to London. I'm going to present my memorial and say, look at what I've done. Give me a chance now to go along to Trinity House to qualify as a master and to and give me a warrant. And the response is absolutely blunt. No, you're too old. So not to be outdone, he gets himself an acting warrant as a schoolmaster, deploys back out to the theatre there, and arrives in Cape Town at the same time as Captain William Fitzwilliam Owen, who was about to set off in the Leven on his great surveys in the ocean. And Owen takes him on board as second master. And how I wish I could tell you, he then spent a wonderful time in that great survey. But no, they get to Bombay, and for some reason he leaves and vanishes. We hear no more about him. And rather a lot of that happens in the 20s. Very fine practitioners drift away or are not brought into the Navy. And it happens particularly once the next man we're going to look at dies and vanishes from the scene. Captain Thomas Hurd, central figure in this lecture, and justifiably so. I should make the case. Another late entrant to the Royal Navy, 19-year-old midshipman. But I do want to stress at the outset, very much a frontline officer. Serves in a crack frigate, lots of nice prize money, thank you very much. Is in charge of the main deck guns of a 74-gun ship in the famous Battle of the Saints. But already he has a skill which has been identified, a particular skill. He comes from Plymouth, not just a naval base, but also a headquarters of the Army Engineer Surveyors. I don't know whether that's significant, but at any rate, he deploys to the North American coast in the flagship and is one of the naval personnel who is deployed to provide naval observations around the fringe of the great mapping that the Army surveyors Holland and Debar are producing in the areas captured from the French. This is a strategic activity that's going on. The British government wanted to divert settlement into that area and reduce pressure on the Indian lands out to the west. And the naval observations in the main comprise soundings and views of the coast. But Hurd very quickly demonstrates that he has skills on a par with the other surveyors, superior skills in astronomy and in geodetic control. And so he tells us in a memorial he submitted that that's why subsequently Admiral Howe took him back to the North American coast in the American War of Independence. And it is Howe who becomes Hurd's patron and gets him some really important jobs, one of which was of huge strategic importance in the years leading up to the French Revolutionary War. Now in the Western Atlantic, the Royal Navy had a problem. Between its base in Halifax and its bases in the Caribbean lay a long hostile coast, where RN warships met at best a very cool reception in the American ports. And so attention shifts out to the Bermudan archipelago, reef-strewn archipelago. Is it possible that a naval base could be established there? Hurd is the man who's sent to find out. He spends quite a number of years out there. The result is two huge survey sheets, incredible. I'll refer you to the wonderful work of Adrian Webb on those. There's a detail here. In the 20th century, when aerial photography became available in this area, they looked at this sort of detail that Hurd had laid down and said, how on earth did he do it? And it is a question. I have pored over plots in the hydrographic office with rays, pencil rays. I think again here he's using horizontal section angles, but again remember he hasn't got a station pointer. Everything has to be plotted on tracing paper and laid down. Absolutely extraordinary work. This is Hurd Channel, which leads into the middle of the archipelago, and Hurd persuades the flag officer on station, another man with acute appreciation of the importance of hydrography, George Murray. He'd worked with George Gould of Florida as the under officer. After he's been taken through in a boat, he's brave enough to have his 74-gun ship taken through there by one of Hurd's Bermudan pilots, and they anchor in Grassy Bay. And from there, Murray writes to the Admiralty. Yeah, you need to pay attention here. Hurd is absolutely right. You want to construct a naval base on the shore of Ireland Island, and that base, as you know, is still there. Well, this amazing work was under inspection in the Admiralty at a crisis point in the Napoleonic War. The Trafalgar campaign was underway. The importance of the close blockade of Brest was at its peak. And at this point, one of the fine 74-gun ships in the key inshore squadron, HMS Magnificent, is wrecked on the edge of the Ashen archipelago, total loss. The Admiralty have absolutely no hesitation. Hurd is the man to go and make a survey and sort out the geography here so the fleet can operate more effectively. It is an extraordinary survey, and we have some extraordinary survivals. Here on the left, a record of the 51 control stations that he established for this survey. And in my book, I explain how the nearest of those was only just outside cannon range of the French coast, well within the pouncing distance of the French chasse marées, which were known to descend and capture British boats and their crews. All the angles and bearings recorded there. And over on the right, that fragile tracing paper plot, how did that survive? On it, all that work plotted. Here down at the bottom, you can see the Bouffalock rock on which the Magnificent was wrecked. And Hurd, once he's in post as hydrographer, turns those into charts for the fleet. Wonderful charts. Here, this extract, you can see a new channel through the archipelago, enabling the small vessels of the British fleet to pounce on the coastal convoys in the Canal before taking war supplies into Brest. The blockade, as a result of this frontline hydrographic work, is being tightened like a vice. This was a really challenging survey. Hurd had colossal difficulties here. He had to work from borrowed boats and borrowed ships, cutters from frigates, which would suddenly say, sorry, we want to go off elsewhere. He was constantly training up new boat crews and new assistants. He had no one else skilled in hydrography to help him. And it's here that he forms a vision. He writes it down in this year, 1804. He begins to plug at it and try and persuade the Admiralty. Look, there are lots of people like me in the fleet with these skills. Why don't you form us into a cadre and give us our own ships, and you'll have a strategic resource. It's a lesson that I only hope people currently working on the Strategic Defence Review might bear in mind. I want to move on now to the last two case studies. How am I doing with time? I'm all right. Two of the men who were early Admiralty surveyors in Hurd's cadre. I wonder if any of you heard of this first one, Master, Mr. George Thomas. He's a very colourful character, and there'll be quite a number of articles about him in Mariner's Mirror. London boy, totally unprivileged background, but one of the boys who benefits from getting a place at Christ's Hospital, where his skill and acumen get him a place in the top cadre of the Royal Mathematical School. Now, Thomas Hurd wanted to get his hands on people from there, but before Trafalgar, most of the products in the school go into the merchant service. George Thomas goes off into the southern whale fishery. And by the time the ship in which he's serving gets to the west coast of South America, war with Spain has broken out. They didn't know. The ship's impounded, and Thomas and his colleagues are plonked into prison, where it seems they were such a nuisance that they let them out. And a rather murky decade follows. Not quite sure what he's up to. I think he spent quite a lot of time in American sealing vessels out in the Pacific. It's certainly an American vessel that he's apprehended by the Royal Navy during the campaign in the River Plate. But old Thomas, he's an astute guy, quickly volunteers, is quickly rated as its mate. And by the end of the commission of that frigate, his captain has got enough information to get him along to Trinity House and qualified as a master. I want, first of all, just to show you the quality of his work, with some examples from his work, early work as an Admiralty surveyor around the British coast, some detail from his survey of Foy, and particularly the use of the red contouring to emphasize the depths. That became a standard feature right through to my day as a surveyor in the Navy. Here we see him in coastal work on the banks of the Suffolk coast. I followed on his footsteps there. I can tell you it's quite challenging work. And I had an engine. He was working under oar. And he's also got the acumen to take that sort of work out to the offshore banks in the North Sea by laying down buoys, by successive ship positions and building up a network of control to get out there. But the point I really want to make this evening is that it's in the front line that his skill is spotted, honed, and put to work. And in a really demanding theatre where plenty of hydrographic practitioners have been before him, including William Bligh, here, like Hurd, working from borrowed boats, tasked to see whether it was possible for a blockading squadron to remain at anchor in approaches to the Scheldt, Napoleon's pistol pointed at Heart England. And the campaign in which Thomas comes to light is the famous 1809 campaign of Volturne. And I want to say straight away, he's not the only practitioner out there. There were quite a few. And here's a good example here of John Tapper, master in Commodore Edward Owen's frigate. Edward Owen, another enlightened officer who knew the value of hydrographic intelligence. And this is very much, I'll put it to you, an intelligence document. I think it's annotations here. There's supposed to be a channel leading through here. These islands apparently now joined together. I didn't have time to look at that. I was too busy here surveying these channels. I don't know whether he found or put in place these navigational marks here, but it was this work by Trotter, Tapper, and others which enabled British troops to be taken around the rear of the island, encircling it. Now, Andrew's sitting at the back there, and this next image, I think, brings out what Andrew always tells us quite rightly about this campaign. Forget the fact that they didn't get to Antwerp. Forget all the squabbling between the Army and Navy. Yes, it was very unfortunate, the deaths, but the strategic objective was achieved with the destruction of the deep water port of Flushing at the mouth of the Scheldt. And the man produced this chart, another practitioner in the area would have agreed absolutely. He said the key to things here is Flushing. It's Captain William Bolton, who commanded 4 ships in succession on this station. The final one was the frigate Fisgard, and his master is George Thomas. And the Fisgard is tasked to pathfind, to make a way clear for the deep draft capital ships and transports that have got to enter the estuary. This is Thomas's survey, a huge red sheet. When that appeared on Hurd's desk, not long after he took over his hydrography, he said, I've never seen anything like this. This is the best bit of work that's come my way. And it really is quite staggering when you think this is being done with that task of laying buoys, positioning marker ships, providing leading lines for those capital ships that are coming in. Yet despite all that, Thomas is able to observe that density of sounding profiles. And as Flushing is taken, he extends his work right into the channels. And I put it to that we have work of similar quality to what he was doing back in the peaceful harbour of Voy. Frontline work. And again, let me just emphasize he's not alone. This is, I think, extremely competent work by Captain Lennox, showing a gateway that the blockading force could use to get through the sands. It's named for another great practitioner, Hancock, there. And indeed, Thomas got criticised quite a bit because he was very self-opinionated. Oh, I did it all. He didn't. But what he did achieve by the end of the war was a complete survey of the whole estuary. Thomas will serve on into his 50s, doing quite remarkable work around the British coast, but he was always intensely proud of his work in the Scheldt, frontline operational work. Our final man, Captain David Ewan Bartholomew, frontline operator. He's another Scot. He's another late entrant to the Royal Navy. He's a very experienced merchant marine master's mate on the cusp of getting his own ship when he's grabbed by the press gang. It's quite a notorious story, again covered in Mariner's Mirror articles. He doesn't help himself. He's got quite a sharp tongue, like the man who becomes his patron, Hume Riggs Popham, who takes Bartholomew with him when he deploys in command of a squadron to the Red Sea. Strategic task: stop the French troops going from Egypt any further into the east. Bartholomew produces the wonderful views on these new charts that Popham produces. Bartholomew is also one of the young men who Popham tells us he took with him and trained in astronomy and in the management of chronometers. And Popham had bought no less than 8 chronometers for this voyage. That is a colossal personal investment, really quite remarkable. And Bartholomew is the young man who is made responsible for looking after them. And if there's anyone here who, like me, has served in a ship where chronometers were important, especially if they were kept wound, you'll realise he had a key job. This is later on. Bartholomew is now first lieutenant of a frigate in the Persian Gulf. And this remarkable feat on the model of Popham's ones, and it is a compendium of navigational intelligence of operational importance. Surveys of anchorages that the Royal Navy might want to enter, views to help them get there. And it's this sort of frontline operational hydrography that Bartholomew will demonstrate again when he goes again under Popham's leadership to the rather infamous campaign on the River Plate. Popham is sent home in disgrace. Bartholomew remains on station and is highly prized and praised by all the successive senior officers for the quality of his pathfinding work. Here, he's positioned a beacon on this dangerous bank in the mainstream there. Again, his proficient high-level work evident. The latitude fixed by the mean of 12 hours in binary latitude of the sun, and longitude by lunar distances. And he carries this work deep into the estuary. There's a little legend there which says that I was the first Englishman to penetrate into the River Uruguay. But I want to just draw your attention here to Colonia, which is where the British troops were mustered to be brought across and landed here at Barragon inside these reefs, ready to invest Buenos Aires. And I'm going to show you now some really remarkable instances of frontline hydrography. This is Captain Benjamin Bainton, who was responsible for that landing. He got the force in through this little swatchway through the banks to land at Barragon. And in the little slip of paper at the top, he says that I was enabled to do that by a transit to objects in line to guide you, provided by David Bartholomew. Well, Bartholomew continues in the front line right the way through the wars. He's in command of the rocket ship Erebus, which fires the rockets at Baltimore, which inspire the Stars and Stripes. And at the end of the war, I think he thought, well, that's it. I don't suppose there'll be any more for me. But no, he's identified as yet another man to be an admiralty surveyor, now out in the Atlantic to address the west coast of Africa and the offshore islands. And he's given a fine ship to do it, the Lebanon, which subsequently will come under the command of Owen, rather more famous under Owen's command. He's also given really a tremendous team, the best men that Hurd could identify to help him, and together they produce work of such a standard, which is unusual at this time, but becomes the hallmark of surveying for the 19th century. Everything they did carefully recorded. And the men he has to help him are Alexander Vidal and William Mudge. They're perfectly competent to understudy his work, but also to be deployed independently. Again, here, this is their work. Comprehensive account of what they've done. And just look at the results. Compare this perhaps to what we've looked at before. Just look at the intensity of the control work, those lines, the clear topography, the way the controls enable the coastline to be laid down, the fringing dangers to control the soundings and the positioning of the anchorage. This is work of hitherto unparalleled quality by people who've been trained in the front line. It also equips Bartholomew for another task, a really challenging one, tackling figures. If you are familiar with charts, you will no doubt have spotted on them those little hieroglyphics, ED, PD, rock reported, discoloured water. The word vidya comes from Spanish or Portuguese, look out. And those reported dangers, as we put on the chart, have been left there until they're disproved. And a task of disproving them falls to people like me, and I can tell you, it's really hard work. And so here, Bartholomew has been tasked to do that in the case of Whale Rock near the Azores. That requires him, bearing in mind that I haven't got any of our modern aids, to lay down a pattern of tracks. You see how underneath he's plotted every reported position of the Whale Rock. And he has to be able to say at the end, I've taken soundings all the way along those tracks. There's nothing less than thousands of fathoms, and we saw nothing from the masthead. Another great gift of Bartholomew, like his patron Hugh Popham, is he's a great mentor, a great trainer of people. He required his midshipmen all to produce a track plot like that. He also set them to work on a training survey here at Funchal, Madeira, under one of his other very bright officers, Alexander Beecher. During one of the port calls here, one of those young midshipmen, George Bartholomew, was buried in the English cemetery below that lowering fortress. I beat to try and look for his grave, couldn't find it. People think it's the captain's son. It wasn't, it was a young relative. Before the second deployment was out, poor old Bartholomew himself was dead. Here again, we see mortality taking skill away, died of typhoid, buried in the Cape Verde Islands, but that mentoring paid off. The first lieutenant Baldy stepped into his shoes, proved to be an excellent, thoughtful captain, deploying his boats in the cool of the evening and the morning off the African coast. And of course, Vidal and Mudge, thoroughly competent to do more detailed and demanding hydrographic work. And then poor Baldy, when the commission finishes, that's the end of his career. But Vidal and Mudge, thank goodness, are kept in play. And indeed, Vidal will return to these waters in command of the paddle steamer Styx. And in these ships are new young men coming up who will turn in subsequent decades to be frontline practitioners, trained by these old hands, men like Bartholomew Sullivan and Thomas Bratt. We've got somebody studying Thomas Bratt here this evening in the campaigns of the Crimean War, where, as Andrew has pointed out, while the senior citizens of the hydrographic world, both at Washington, were called into the councils of the politicians, the young men are out here pathfinding in the field. something that went on right into the beginning of this millennium. The Iraq War, the need to execute an amphibious landing. The Americans had and have no capability to deploy hydrography up threat. We had. Little HMS Roebuck, the first Sea Lord at the time, remarked, the smallest ship in the force fell the most important task of going in and finding the way in for the amphibious landing. Will the Strategic Defence Review ensure that we retain that capability? I'm sure that Thomas Hurd is looking on with interest. Thank you for your attention.
Shall we eliminate those and open the floor for observations okay here and
Your reference to the Iraq War, in 1950, during the South Korean War, the United States Marine Corps wanted to attack Incheon, but before they could do so, they had to find out whether the channel leading into the port, the Flying Fish Channel, is probably the bay. Our people had done it in 1872. He's named after them. You're brilliant. They landed a partridge party on the island of Volvidu, which is in the harbour, and quickly discovered that the quite detailed chart was accurate, and that meant that the landing craft, LSTs, LCIs, and all the rest were moving, and although they were stranded by the tides, a 50-foot tidal break, they still managed to do so, and they did it with no casualties. Not bad, eh?
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, the heritage of charting has come into its own quite a bit. Yes.
okay, there's one here and then there's the behind you and see if anybody on at home has got it.
Thank you. What I was wondering, really, fairly early on, at the outset, is the dissemination of this information, because it's not an easy matter, no doubt, printing charts on it, and I can't imagine that, you know, every piece of work transcribed into a printed chart. But I mean, maybe the more important ones. But can you tell us anything about that?
Yes, it's a very interesting thread in the tale, because we were a long way behind. I would say that the 18th century is very much like now. Britain's the land of small government. We don't want a big government. The French had a wonderful depot of charts and plans in 1720. Some of our prisoners of war in France, their eyes were out on organ stocks when they saw the wonderful charts that were provided to French ships by their government. Not in Britain. As I mentioned, the masters had to find the charts on board. They had to go to the chandlers to get those. When Alexander Dalrymple was appointed hydrographer to the Admiralty in 1795, his remit was to recommend which of those should be bought, also to keep an eye open for what was coming in from the fleet, which the clerks were tending to pile up in the Admiralty attic. He had no remit to commission surveys, nor to publish charts, but he began to do so at the turn of the century. He persuaded the Admiralty to allow him to buy a little proof printing press. And he had great encouragement from Thomas Troubridge, who's a real key figure, actually. He was one of the members of Vincent's highly criticised Admiralty Board. But he was working in tandem with his old chum out in the Mediterranean, Nelson. And in the Mediterranean, there'd been a wonderful campaign of data gathering in the Peace of Amiens. And that information began to come into the Admiralty. Troubridge was on the lookout, grabbed it, took it straight to Dalrymple, run this lot off, and 20 copies went straight back out to the fleet, where they were already spreading manuscript copies around. And from there it builds up, and when Hurd takes over, the Admiralty chart as a fleet asset begins to take off. And by the end of the war, Hurd is distributing charts in boxes through all the chart depots to the ships. But it's very much a wartime development, and early on it wasn't happening.
Just thought it must be tremendously expensive printing so many charts.
Yeah, it was also a great discouragement. One reason why some good practitioners out there, naval practitioners, used to send their work to the commercial publishers to publish was that they knew if it went into the Admiralty, it would get lost. I mentioned a man, Alexander Beecher, there in the 1820s.
And presumably the East India Company would really, Mangalore, this would be more, shall we say, in their remit, that they would have said, okay, we want charts for our voyages.
And that's an excellent point, because certainly, I think Hurd, even when he took over, rather expected the East India Company to look after that quarter of the world, and certainly they grabbed all the naval information that was going. Most of the Royal Naval work that was published by the East India Company to begin with for the East Indies.
Okay, we'll take one from the floor and then we'll address the one online. So first.
Yeah, very quickly. Yeah, thank you very, very much. I'm particularly intrigued by your point about something which tends to be very much forgotten. You referred to the recommissioning of ships and crews in 1790, I think, on the Spanish. We tend to forget that one. But my question is, you referred to some charts which may have been developed from original Spanish chart. When Peninsular War started, did a lot of Spanish charts in the Americas, and indeed maybe the Philippines, were they made available to the British?
That's interesting that they were, in fact, rather more than ones in the Spanish mainland, because one impact of Napoleon's invasion and then subsequently the rather reactionary developments in Spain was that a lot of Spaniards went into exile. And one of them came here to London and set up a sort of outstation of the Spanish Hydrographic Department in London. And he made available a vast quantity of the wonderful work that Spanish surveyors have been doing around South America. By contrast, it was very different in Spain. In my book, the one character who fascinates me is Felipe, who ended up here in London in exile. But he was in Madrid when Napoleon invaded. One of Napoleon's party went and knocked on Barrett's door and tried to persuade him to help the French, particularly by handing over material for the border areas. Barrett didn't want to do that. He managed to smuggle out of Madrid quite a lot of information and get it down to Cadiz. And from there, he arranged with the British that if Cadiz fell, they'd take it elsewhere. But whilst he worked quite well with the generals, he didn't work quite so well with the naval authorities. So I think here there's the, I'm interested to see what Catherine thinks here, but the aftermath of Trafalgar, where two of Spain's leading hydrographers have been killed. I think there's quite a bit of ill feeling there. So in London, poor old Hurd was a bit stuck because people were pestering him saying, look, old Tofino, Catherine's work here, wonderful surveys of the Spanish coast. Can't you give it to us? And he had to say, well, I only got one copy myself here in London. So he sent out Admiral after Cadiz and said, can you get more of the Spanish charts? And he did manage to get a set, but he didn't pass it on. So you get this eternal cry. And it's interesting, one particular bit of work they missed out on had been conducted subsequent to Tofino's great campaign. A lot of extra work had been done around the Spanish coast, and Pathfinders published that in Cadiz during that period, but it doesn't seem to have reached the British fleet, who then had to go and do their own surveys of a number of those locations. So fascinating. But South America, yes, it was all shared.
Yeah, there's a question online, and then we'll come to Ron, about, well, you can mute yourself, but why historians assume the absence of Royal Naval hydrography given the foundations by Cook and Barritt.
I think, I wonder whether people think of Cook and Bligh as explorers rather than hydrographers sometimes. That they were eminent and that they produced a whole school of people. I mean, Flinders, one of the most remarkable hydrographic practitioners of the period, grew out of those voyages. We've seen Haywood, product of the Bounty voyage, Thomas Haywood, another Bounty survivor. So yes, there was hydrography out there, but it's interesting. One of the places where you hear this downplaying of hydrography in the Royal Navy is amongst the historians of the East India Company and of biographies of Alexander Dalrymple. There's this, and it seems to have stuck. But I think I don't want to name names. If I invite you to look at some of the standard histories of the Royal Naval in this period, hunt for hydrography, and you don't see much mention.
Very good, okay, no, yes.
So you mentioned the survey of the river Sharks in 1809. Were there no charts before then? It was a major water.
Yes, in fact, the outstanding French surveyor, Beautemps had been active there. It was one of the few areas where he could be active, because everywhere else we were there and were stopping him. The only places where he produced surveys during that period were the Scheldt and the Adriatic. But of course, it wasn't available to us. There was some work of an earlier period, but not of the quality and detail that was needed for the sort of operation that was being mounted there.
It was economically another voyage in 1648, so there wasn't a great demand for commercial sharks or a major seaway which had been denied economic access. So I think that's one of the problems. There isn't this trading organization happening, which is making a demand for large vessels to pass up and down the shelf, as had been the case down to 1648. And now there were primitive charts available. So this is essentially new territory to be charted. Nelson is planning to go in there in 1801. He's talked to Bligh about this. So that as soon as the British identified this as their target, they're very much aware of this. And Nelson's connection with that emphasizes the vital role of hydrography in opening up this space. So essentially, it's the economic nullity of the shelf, which means there really was no commercial need for deep water sharks. There's no deep water shipping.
And I guess also, Andrew, that the theatre gets an increased prominence once post-Trafalgar Napoleon sees Antwerp as the place to build up a new fleet and a new threat.
Essentially, Antwerp becomes the single most important French dockyard for the as you mentioned, Mike, the blockade of Brest means the French can't build ships at Brest, so their fleet is literally disappearing. So Napoleon is moving his naval bases eastward towards the Baltic sources of supply, and Antwerp is one of the big stations. He's then moving on to Hamburg, and he's thinking about building a dockyard inside the Baltic. So the effect of the blockade is essentially to push French naval construction out of the North Sea Channel area, increasingly eastwards. So those charts are enabling that blockade, which then has the effect of forcing the public to put huge resources into an entirely new thing.
Thank you.
Right. Yes.
Thank you. That's great. Was there a concept of ownership as well, in terms of who owns the knowledge, or when they've done, a practitioner has done a survey, who does that knowledge belong to? Can they be free with it? Can they sell it very freely privately to the private chart maker? Or does it belong to the Admiralty? And how does that work?
Before really the process of producing average charts gets underway, people were regularly giving their work to commercial sellers to produce, and I imagine they got paid for it. And indeed, some of the main charting companies were quite keen to get people on their books so they could expect a regular throughput of work from John Knight, a prominent example. So I imagine, yes, they got a reward. Once Dalrymple's in place, he's absolutely incandescent. I don't want this stuff going out there. I want it here in the Admiralty. And I think once it's in the Admiralty, it's Admiralty information, just as remarkable. Because if you think about the the great voyages and some of the controversies surrounding them, particularly, if I'm correctly, the dry voyages, a number of the other officers were very fed up that they were required to surrender their journals and their charts when they got back to Britain. It definitely became official data. There's also, I think, an issue of ownership between countries. That differs between war and peace. There's the famous incident of Dalrymple's demise, very much prompted, it appears, by the fact that we had captured a frigate which had on board copies of the French surveys from Australia. That had been carried out. The French had a passport from us, as had Matthew Flinders on our part. And Dalrymple saw that very much as part of the world of science that he and Sir Joseph Banks had promoted, that should be separate from conflict. So he had that work and he refused to hand it over. He said, no, we're not going to use it for wartime purposes. It's sacrosanct. New people on the scene like Thomas Hurd, Edward Columbine saw it differently. And they lobbied the government and said, look, we need to use this for strategic and operational purposes. And Dalrymple was overruled and died very shortly afterwards. It changes in peacetime, and then eager to exchange data with other hydrographic offices, people like Beechey, Beechey, the Hurd's successor, are very respectful of other countries, and if they use information, they're very careful to acknowledge it on empty charts. So yes, ownership is quite a complex issue.
Yes.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed that. You showed at the beginning pie charts. Could you talk about a bit more about how you actually got that data? How do you know that there's 187 captains or whatever in command? I don't remember the numbers, but how did you work that one out?
Painstakingly,
Where were you looking?
I worked at this for over a decade and a half, and the full results, I hope eventually to publish a specialist volume, which will go out at some incredible price if I manage to get it printed, but where I'll list all these practitioners. I started with the key resource, which is the archive of the United Kingdom Hydrographic Office, where most of this data resides, that such as has survived. But in the 1820s, that chap I mentioned, Alexander Beecher, wrote down a complete list of all the holdings, all the stuff that was, he talks about it piled in promiscuous dusty heaps in the Alloy attics. He lists all the practitioners. And fortunately, we have his original manuscript for many of those charts, tragically, were disposed of during the 19th century. But I've got there's a pretty complete listing of practitioners. So that's my starting point. Then I've hunted around in other archives and gradually built up the listing. I suspect there are more, but people out there who sadly have been forgotten. Every so often you see a Christie's or someone else, and they've got a wonderful art book or even a chart out there, which will probably end up in some private home in America. It ought to be in our museum so we can get at it and complete the list. As I say, I found over 1,000 surveys. I'm sure there were many more. I hope that's an adequate answer.
No, it's good. Thank you.
Well, both products of the Scottish Education System, and we're talking earlier on in the North America. The O-level system in Scotland, it was arithmetic, not mathematics, and part of the O-level was geometry and trigonometry. And you probably recall that. I did it, I'm sure you did.
Yes. It's interesting, isn't it, to see how far back that goes. And there's some wonderful examples. I think at the Malcolm brothers, two admirals, and one was he a general or was he just a colonial administrator? Anyway, Charles Malcolm later on commands the Indian Navy. They started off on a hill farm in the lowlands of Scotland. They went barefooted to school in the local village and began to pick up mathematical education. John Murray, who surveys the Sussex coast, he's identified by William Bligh to do the job. Absolutely unprivileged background. His father was a day worker at the Tron Church in Edinburgh. But he clearly had a mathematical education. He works in Australia with Flinders, and he comes back and produces the most magnificent work. Poor old John Ross, who gets such a bad press nowadays, came from Ayr, where astronomy was taught from the 1720s. He was a fine astronomer and surveyor, and the nonsense that Fergus Fleming and others write about the leaders of the first Arctic expeditions being unqualified for the job is rubbish. They were both Scots, both with good education. Ross had proved he could survey in the front line in the Baltic and in the White Sea. These were accomplished men, and to suggest otherwise is false.
As was Thomas Brisbane.
So,
As was Thomas Brisbane from Lords.
yes.
I noted this crime.
Well, there is, of course, much more in the book, which is available to you. So I would encourage you to have a look and to think about purchasing that. There's a second book there, actually, if you want to be on the mailing list. If you think you're not already on the mailing list for this seminar and you'd like to be, then a legible name and a legible email in that book on the end will do. But the more important book is Nelson's Pathfinders, which is there. And of course, we can continue to ask questions and talk about it informally over a glass of wine, courtesy of Yale University Press, after we thanked Michael for a wonderful time. Thank everyone at home. Oh, there's another question online. It's not too late. They're still there. He might still be there.
Yes, there was indeed. I don't know whether it's still there online, but
Except for now it's noisy, so I guess it's gonna have to be one way. He'll hear you through that.
yeah, yes. I'm going to have a mental blank now, but of course there was that wonderful chap who had been in the Portuguese Navy, then became part of their survey establishment, and who Barclay took on to his staff once he was put in charge of the Portuguese Navy, and he produced a wonderful set of charts and of directions for the Portuguese coast. And I know there's a copy in the British Library which I've consulted. So yes, I should. Sorry, I didn't mention that, but yes, indeed. Very good liaison there, which was important because if you remember, Torfinho complained that he hadn't been able to cover the Portuguese coast properly because Portuguese charts were kept in manuscript, I understand, in the 18th century to prevent them being used by other powers. But I welcome any comment from you. I'm sure that Alan will send on to me anything you want to type in the remarks there, but I think I need to go and mix with the crowd here. But thank you so much for your question.
You might take something. Yes. Okay.